So Azure App Configuration is a feature that is really useful if you want to store your configuration in a centralized universal location hosted by Azure. And Mark has joined me here to talk about a couple of new step templates that he's built around supporting Azure App Configuration. Hi, Mark. How's it going?
Yeah, very well, John. How are you?
Good, good. So app configuration. This is again. I should let folks know that you actually helped build the integration with Vault, and that is a key value store. And I guess this is kind of continuing on with that theme now, is it?
Yeah, it's exactly that. So really the power of step templates are that we can integrate with anything that has, like a REST API or a CLI, and utilizing things like Octopus output variables and the like means that we can add in some of that functionality into Octopus and integrate with tools that all of our customers are using. So you're spot on. The kind of Azure app configuration was just the next step and next iteration, sorry, into providing that.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's go ahead and fire up your screen here, and let's take a look at what this is all about.
Yeah, absolutely. So this will be familiar to a whole bunch of people, like the Azure portal. So what I've got here is just an Azure app configuration store. So I've got a bunch of different keys, some with labels. So it was one of the really nice features of Azure App Config. If you wanted to, there's different ways you can model kind of app configuration, I've found. So you could have like an app configuration store per environment. That's one kind of recommendation that Microsoft says. But that also there's costs involved in that, so you might want to just have them all in one store. And what you can do is you can basically segregate your values with specific labels. So we'll see an example of how this value here is used, but I've got a cluster namespace, and for development, as you can imagine, I've got my namespace here of Mark Harrison Development, and that's got a label of development that matches that environment, and so on and so forth for test and production. You can also have kind of like richer content, so you can have JSON types in here as well. So here you can see I've just got an example JSON here. Oh look, it's got your name there as well, John. That was just pure fluke, I promise. I and obviously you're 30, so there you go. And you haven't got a car though. Yeah. But again, that's all kind of added here. So it's got that really kind of flexible kind of key representations and mappings, and like I say, kind of supports labels. The other thing I should say, super easy to integrate with. So I'm a big fan of the Azure CLI and CLIs in general. That's how these two step templates that we're going to talk about integrate. So let's switch over to the community library. I'm a big fan of the community library. My team do an awful lot of work maintaining and creating new step templates. So no surprise that here we are. So this first one retrieves, as the description alludes to, one or more key values from Azure App Config. And for each one of those, it will create an output variable. So in Octopus, an output variable is a variable that's created at deployment time or in a runbook. And so for each value that you retrieve from a configuration store, it will create an output value for you. Why is that useful? Well, because then you can then use those values further downstream in any application you want to deploy, or if you need to use them in a particular way in your deployment itself, that's also totally possible. Now, there are a whole bunch of different parameters. I won't go and bore your watchers with all of them today. The kind of main ones are you need an Azure account. So that's something that we support in Octopus, a service principal that has permissions to retrieve those values from the config store, obviously. You can choose either the config store name or the endpoint. So each config store has an accessible endpoint that you can retrieve from. And really the main one after that is the key names. So what keys do you want to retrieve from the config store? I did think about providing the ability to retrieve everything, but the thought process behind not doing that is because you have this central config store. Usually each application will want potentially different settings. So I wanted to provide a nice, easy way for customers to retrieve those values, but only the ones they wanted. Likewise, though, if you had a whole bunch of keys in here, you don't want, let's say you had, I don't know, 400, which is probably maybe a bit too large for an application, but say you had 50. For an application, that's not unheard of. You don't really want to have to enter 50 different keys in the step. So what the step allows you to do is it actually supports wildcards. And this is actually native into the Azure CLI as well. So you can just put in a key name. So an example here, if you had ones that were just prefixed with application dot, you could do application star, and then that will bring in all of the relevant values that match that key. And you can retrieve multiple values, so they're just new lines for each one. And again, you have that label support. You can also save values as sensitive output variables. So maybe you've got a password in there or something that you want to have Octopus mask and treat as a sensitive value as if it was a normal Octopus variable. You can do that as well, and some other bits and bobs. So that's that one. The second one, I need to go and search for it. Azure. So this one builds on that previous one. So the previous one was just retrieving those values from Azure App Config and then saving the values as variables, so you can use them in Octopus. This one is kind of like, I kind of think of it as a combined step template, John. So you have the retrieval process, so same kind of parameters. You need to go and retrieve those values from app config, but actually maybe you just want to publish them directly to an Azure function. And so we've had customers in the past asking to do that. So having that kind of combined step is really useful, because then it means that you just retrieve those values, the exact settings you want before, and then you can just provide the name of the Azure App function, and then it will publish them all in one go, which is quite useful. One other kind of, I wouldn't call it a superpower, but a nice feature for this step template as well, is you can also add in additional settings. So imagine you have the situation where you've got 4 of your app settings that are in Azure App Config. Go and retrieve those using the keys that you specify. But also there's something from either a third party or something maybe built into Octopus that you want to pass in and set as an app setting. This parameter allows you to do that. It kind of allows you to augment any app settings you get from Azure App Config with any values you want yourself. So again, you kind of get the best of both worlds. You can choose them from a different source. So with that said, let's jump into a demo. So here's my demo Octopus instance. I've got 2 projects. So the first one is just this one here called Snow Globe. It's going to deploy a load balancer service to Azure Kubernetes service. And what it does is it's going to retrieve 2 values. So the first, or 2 sets of values, I should say. The first one is environment specific values. So that's going to get these values here that have a particular label. And so what you'll see when you look at the step, when it loads, is so we've got my Azure account, you've got the config store name. These are all just variables in the project itself. You've got the cluster namespace. So I'm saying for this particular run of this step, I want to go and get the cluster namespace. And I've also specified a label, the environment name. So what Octopus will do is it will take that, it will evaluate the environment name, being dev, test, or production, and it will use that in the command itself. So what you should get from this is, as it runs, progressing through, as you know, John, through a life cycle in Octopus, where you go through dev, test, and production, it will get the right value, the right cluster namespace for each of those labels, because it's going to change each time. So that's an example of how you can use it for kind of label-based values. But likewise, you might just want to have other values. So here I've got web app port, HTTP port, HTTPS port, and the web app name itself. So these will be retrieved. They'll create output variables for each one of these, and then I'm going to use those later on in my actual service itself. So if you switch to my service just quickly, I've got some YAML source code here, and you can see I've got these Snow Globe web app HTTP port, HTTPS port, and its web app name as well. Now, those values themselves aren't actually output variables. So what I'm using here is a kind of shorthand in Octopus variable syntax that allows you to replace values out. So we just quickly pop over to the variables. What you can see here is I've got my web app ones here that were referenced in that YAML definition that we're going to deploy to Kubernetes. And you can actually see that I'm kind of replacing them with the value that it gets from those steps. So this is just a kind of like syntactic sugar, if you like, a nice way to not have a very, very long variable name in your YAML definition. And so if we go and deploy this release, we'll just do this one to development. What we should see on those 2 steps there, it will go and make 2 calls to Azure App Config, one to retrieve the values that are specified by their labels, and the other one will just go and get the specific values that we've asked for. We'll just expand out the task log. What the task will do, because it's configured to do so, is it will tell you the variable names. This is quite useful when you're debugging, and that's an option you can turn on or off in the task settings. So it's created one output variable there and 3 there, which is what I'd expect, because I've got my one cluster namespace variable and my 3 specific values that I wanted to get. And then once it's done all that, it will then deploy our service out, and we should find that it's deploying our YAML with the right web app name. In fact, we could also, I don't know, also show our Kubernetes object status. I don't know if I've enabled it. Let's see. There we go. And so we've got our Snowglobe web app as well. And we've got our ports that it's specified. So yeah, that's kind of just a really quick rundown of how you can retrieve values from Azure App Config, both based on label or specific values. Use the output of that, which is output variables, and then use them in a kind of subsequent step in your deployment. So that's the kind of simple. Do you have any questions on that, John?
No, that's all intuitive. Obviously, key values are really important for an application. So if you happen to require an external service for persisting your key values in a safe and secure location, potentially Azure App Config or Vault or somewhere else, I'm sure Mark and his team have a solution for you. So these are available up on the library now. You can go to library.octopus.com, or you'll see them listed in the community step templates under your instance. Any last words before we wrap up here, Mark?
Yeah, just one thing. So in addition to this video, we've also got a blog post coming out, I think early next week, just around the steps themselves, some of the parameters. They go into a bit more detail than I did today, just how you can use them and some kind of examples, screenshots, kind of like I showed today on the call.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Mark.
No worries.